Flight attendant doubts black man's first-class ticket. His identity as a tech CEO changes everything. What happens when a high-flying tech CEO and a sharp-tongued financial analyst find themselves clashing in the confined space of an airplane, only to face a crisis that forces them to work together? Amid a tense confrontation, a life-threatening emergency, and revelations that could change everything, their journey becomes more than just a flight. Will they overcome their differences in time, or will their biases cost more than they bargained for? Let's stick around to find out. But before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from today. If you enjoy this tale, don't forget to subscribe. Michael Anderson, a 35-year-old CEO of TechVision, stood quietly in the crowded boarding area of San Francisco International Airport. Despite his professional success, Michael exuded a humble demeanor, his tailored suit blending with the sea of travelers. He was used to flying frequently, a part of the job that came with running one of the most innovative tech companies in the world. As the boarding call for first-class passengers echoed through the terminal, Michael adjusted the strap of his sleek black carry-on bag and joined the queue. He barely noticed the glances directed his way, a mix of curiosity and judgment, perhaps due to his relatively young age for such an elite section. Just as he was about to hand over his ticket, a sharp voice interrupted him. "Excuse me, sir. I think you might be in the wrong line," said Sarah Williams, her tone crisp and authoritative. She was impeccably dressed in a navy blazer, her appearance screaming corporate professionalism. Her gaze swept over Michael, lingering disapprovingly on his casual leather sneakers. Michael turned, his brow furrowed. "I'm sorry, what do you mean?" Sarah folded her arms, her voice rising enough to catch the attention of nearby passengers. "This is the first-class line. Economy boarding is over there." She pointed toward the adjacent lane, where passengers with larger bags and weary faces waited their turn. A hush fell over the crowd, a few curious heads turning to watch the exchange. Michael glanced at the boarding pass in his hand, the golden stamp of first class clear as day. "I'm aware," he said calmly, holding up the pass. "I'm in the right line." Sarah's eyes flickered to the ticket, then back to his face, skepticism etched deeply in her expression. "That's unusual," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "I didn't realize they let people upgrade so easily." The insinuation stung, but Michael remained composed. "I didn't upgrade. I booked this seat." Before he could step forward, Sarah blocked his path. "Look, I don't mean to be rude, but I've seen this before. Sometimes people try to sneak into first class. I'm just trying to make sure everyone boards properly." A murmur rippled through the line. Michael felt the heat of judgmental stares boring into his back. His jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain polite. "I assure you, I belong here. If there's a problem, the airline staff can verify it." At that moment, a flight attendant stepped over, her professional smile faltering as she assessed the tension. "Is everything all right here?" "Yes," Michael said, relief washing over him. "Here's my boarding pass." The flight attendant took the ticket, scanned it, and returned it with a nod. "You're all set, Mr. Anderson. Welcome aboard." Michael shot a pointed glance at Sarah before stepping forward, but she wasn't done yet. "That's strange," Sarah blurted out, more loudly than she intended. "I mean, no offense, but you don't exactly look like someone who flies first class." The words hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. A collective gasp emerged from the nearby passengers. Michael stopped mid-step, his shoulders stiffening. Slowly, he turned back to face her. "Is there a specific way first-class passengers are supposed to look?" he asked, his tone sharp now, slicing through the tension. Sarah faltered, her confidence shaken for the first time. "I well know. But, it's uncommon." Michael stared at her, the controlled anger in his eyes silencing her completely. He could feel the weight of the moment, the judgment Sarah embodied, not just from her but from others who had likely made the same assumptions in their minds. "Perhaps next time, you could ask questions before making assumptions," he said firmly, but without raising his voice. The flight attendant, sensing the awkwardness, ushered Michael forward. "Right this way, Mr. Anderson." As Michael walked toward the jet bridge, He heard the hushed conversations trailing behind him. Some passengers whispered in agreement with Sarah's initial challenge, while others seemed appalled by her blatant display of prejudice. "Can you believe she said that out loud?" someone muttered. "Maybe he's someone important," another speculated. Sarah, meanwhile, stood frozen, her face flushed with embarrassment. She quickly handed over her boarding pass and followed into the plane, her mind swirling with thoughts of the exchange. Part of her wanted to rationalize her actions. After all, she had only been protecting her space, hadn't she? Yet, a nagging feeling of guilt began to creep in. Inside the plane, Michael settled into his seat by the window, putting on his noise-canceling headphones. He tried to shake off the encounter, but the sting of her words lingered. As a self-made entrepreneur, he was no stranger to people doubting his worth. Still, it never got easier. A few minutes later, Sarah walked down the aisle. Her eyes widened slightly as she realized her seat was directly across from Michael's. The awkwardness was palpable as she hesitated before sitting down. Michael didn't acknowledge her. Instead, he focused on the view outside the window, the horizon stretching endlessly over the bustling airport below. Sarah fidgeted uncomfortably, stealing glances at him as she adjusted her bag. The silence between them was deafening. As the plane began to taxi, Sarah finally spoke, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. I didn't mean to offend you back there." Michael didn't respond immediately. He turned his head, meeting her gaze with an unreadable expression. "You did," he said simply, his voice calm but firm. Sarah looked down at her hands, a flush creeping up her neck. "I'm sorry. I guess I jumped to conclusions." Michael didn't say anything more, but his silence was heavy with meaning. For the rest of the taxi and takeoff, Sarah sat quietly, replaying the confrontation in her mind. She couldn't shake the image of his expression, the mix of disappointment and resignation. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself, her values, and the man sitting across from her. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, Michael stared out the window, his reflection faintly visible against the bright blue sky. The confrontation with Sarah was still fresh in his mind, but he had no interest in dwelling on it. He leaned back, closing his eyes, hoping for a few hours of peace. But peace, as always, was fleeting. Michael's thoughts wandered, pulling him back to the early days of his career, a time when judgment and doubt weren't the exception but the rule. Michael Anderson had been born in the suburbs of Detroit, Michigan, into a family that lived paycheck to paycheck. His father, an auto mechanic, and his mother, a part-time nurse, worked tirelessly to provide for Michael and his two younger siblings. Growing up, Michael had no illusions about privilege or easy opportunities. He learned early on that if he wanted something, he had to work for it. In high school, Michael discovered his passion for technology. While his peers played sports or attended parties, Michael spent late nights in the school library, devouring books on programming and software design. He built his first app at 16, a rudimentary calendar tool for students, and earned a modest $200 when the school district decided to adopt it. That taste of success planted a seed of ambition in him. After high school, Michael earned a scholarship to Stanford University, where he studied computer science. But even in this prestigious environment, he often felt like an outsider. While many of his peers came from wealthy families with connections, Michael worked nights at a local diner to cover what the scholarship didn't. He was no stranger to dismissive glances or whispered comments about his second-hand clothes and perpetually scuffed shoes. Despite the challenges, Michael excelled. By the time he graduated, he had already founded a small tech startup with a few friends. They called it TechVision, and it began as a humble idea: creating AI-driven tools to solve real-world problems, particularly in healthcare and education. The journey from idea to success, however, was anything but smooth. In the early years, Michael lived on instant noodles and worked 18-hour days in a cramped apartment that doubled as an office. Investors dismissed him as inexperienced. Potential clients balked at his youth and lack of connections. There were moments when the company was on the brink of collapse, but Michael's determination never wavered. The breakthrough came 3 years later when TechVision developed an AI algorithm capable of early-stage cancer detection. The innovation caught the attention of major healthcare providers, and funding finally poured in. By his 30th birthday, Michael was hailed as one of the most promising young entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. But the success came with a price. As tech vision grew, so did Michael's responsibilities and the scrutiny he faced. In every boardroom, at every conference, he felt the weight of unspoken doubts, the lingering prejudice that someone like him couldn't possibly belong in these circles. The plane jolted slightly, pulling Michael from his thoughts. He glanced at Sarah, who was absorbed in her tablet. Her posture was tense, her lips pressed into a thin line, as if she were trying to focus on anything but the man across from her. Michael recognized the expression all too well. It wasn't just discomfort, it was self-doubt. He wondered what had driven her to act so aggressively earlier. People weren't born with prejudice. They learned it somewhere along the way. Sarah Williams wasn't the first person to underestimate him, but Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he'd seen her before. As he sat in the quiet hum of the plane, another memory surfaced, a moment buried under years of rapid growth and relentless decision-making. 3 years ago, during TechVision's expansion, they had opened a new division focused on AI applications for financial analytics. The hiring process had been grueling, with hundreds of candidates vying for just a handful of positions. One applicant had stood out, not for her skills but for her overconfidence. Her name had been Sarah Williams. At the time, Michael had reviewed her application personally. She had an impressive resume, but her interview had left him with doubts. Sarah's answers had been polished but impersonal, her attitude bordering on arrogance. When asked how she would approach integrating AI with ethical financial practices, her response had been dismissive, emphasizing profit over innovation or responsibility. It was a red flag for Michael, who believed that technology should serve people, not just numbers. In the end, Sarah hadn't been offered the position. Michael hadn't thought much about it afterward. Rejections were a necessary part of building a company, and he had no way of knowing the impact it had on her. Now, sitting across from her, he realized that this was the same Sarah Williams. The tension between them wasn't just about a seat on an airplane. It was rooted in something far deeper, a moment that had shaped both their lives in ways neither of them could have predicted. Sarah, oblivious to Michael's realization, continued scrolling through her tablet. But her focus wasn't on the screen. She was replaying the earlier confrontation in her mind, each word she'd spoken ringing louder in her ears. She hated to admit it, but she felt guilty. It wasn't like her to judge people so quickly, or at least, that's what she told herself. But the truth was harder to face. Sarah had spent years fighting to prove her worth in a male-dominated industry, clawing her way up the corporate ladder. Somewhere along the way, she had adopted the same harsh judgments that had once been directed at her. And now, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen Michael before. Her mind raced, scanning through her professional encounters. TechVision. The name sparked something. Then it hit her, the rejection email. 3 years ago, she had applied for a role at TechVision, convinced she was a perfect fit. When the rejection came, she had been furious, blaming the decision on bias or politics. She had never considered that it might have been her own shortcomings. And now, sitting across from the man who had likely made that decision, she felt a mix of resentment and shame. The confrontation earlier wasn't just about his appearance or the ticket. It was about the lingering bitterness she carried. The realization hung between them, unspoken but tangible. Michael said nothing, his mind piecing together the connection, while Sarah wrestled with her own thoughts. Neither of them could have anticipated what lay ahead on this flight, a journey that would force them to confront not just each other, but the masks they wore to hide their vulnerabilities. The steady hum of the airplane's engines filled the cabin, lulling some passengers into sleep while others occupied themselves with books, movies, or quiet conversations. Michael, still seated by the window, had just begun to relax when the man seated next to him spoke. "You're Michael Anderson, aren't you?" Michael turned to see an older man with salt and pepper hair and a warm smile. He was dressed casually but neatly, his sharp eyes hinting at a keen intellect. "Yes," Michael replied, his voice measured. "I am. And you are?" "James Parker," the man said, extending a hand. "I'm a radiologist. I've read about your work with TechVision." Incredible stuff you're doing with AI and early cancer detection. Michael's guarded demeanor softened slightly. He shook James's hand. Thank you. It's always good to hear that the work is making a difference. It's more than just a difference, James said enthusiastically. Your algorithm helped save a colleague of mine, detected a tumor that traditional scans missed. It's remarkable technology. Michael offered a modest smile. He was used to receiving praise for TechVision's achievements, but hearing a personal story always reminded him of why he started the company in the first place. Their conversation naturally deepened as James shared his experiences in the medical field, highlighting how AI had revolutionized diagnostic accuracy. He was clearly passionate about his work and deeply appreciative of TechVision's contributions. Michael, in turn, explained the challenges his team faced, both technical and ethical, in developing such a powerful tool. Across the aisle, Sarah couldn't help but overhear their conversation. She had spent the last hour attempting to focus on her tablet, but her thoughts kept drifting back to her earlier confrontation with Michael. She had dismissed him as someone who didn't belong, only to learn that he not only belonged but had likely achieved more than she could imagine. Now, as she listened to James praise Michael's work, her discomfort grew. It wasn't just guilt. It was the realization that her assumptions had been both wrong and unfair. She stole a glance at Michael, who was animatedly explaining how TechVision's AI could identify patterns invisible to the human eye. His passion was evident, his knowledge impressive. This wasn't the man she had pegged as an outsider. This was a visionary, someone making real change in the world. Meanwhile, James leaned closer to Michael, his voice dropping slightly. I imagine it hasn't been easy, breaking through in such a competitive field, especially at your age. Michael chuckled, though it lacked humor. You could say that. People have a hard time looking past what they expect to see. I've lost count of how many times I've had to prove myself, not because my work isn't good, but because I don't fit their idea of what a CEO should look like. James nodded knowingly. The world is slow to change, but people like you are the ones pushing it forward. Keep at it. Their conversation didn't go unnoticed. Other passengers in the first-class cabin began whispering, some nudging each other discreetly as they recognized Michael's name. A middle-aged woman leaned across the aisle to speak. Excuse me, she said hesitantly. Are you the Michael Anderson who developed that AI program for hospitals? My niece is a nurse, and she mentioned your company. She said it's been a game-changer. Michael smiled politely. Yes, that's me. I'm glad to hear it's helping. Another passenger chimed in, this time a younger man in a business suit. TechVision, right? I read about you in Forbes. Didn't they call you the AI Maverick? The attention made Michael slightly uncomfortable, but he handled it with grace, answering their questions and acknowledging their comments. Slowly, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. The earlier judgment and skepticism directed toward him were replaced with admiration and curiosity. Sarah, still silent, felt the weight of her earlier words pressing down on her. The very man she had dismissed so easily was now being recognized and celebrated by everyone around her. She thought back to their argument at the gate, the tone of her voice, the assumptions she had made. The conversation with James continued, drifting to TechVision's future projects. Michael mentioned a new initiative, an AI platform designed to help underserved communities access affordable healthcare. That's the next frontier, Michael said. It's not just about advancing technology. It's about ensuring it reaches the people who need it most. There's a huge gap in access right now, and AI can help bridge it. James's expression lit up. That's incredible. It's about time someone in tech thought beyond profits. Sarah's chest tightened. Each word Michael spoke chipped away at the image she had built of him in her mind. He wasn't just successful. He was purposeful, driven by values she hadn't given him credit for. As the conversation wound down, James glanced at Sarah. You've been awfully quiet over there. Do you work in tech too? Caught off guard, Sarah hesitated before responding. Yes, I do. I'm a financial analyst. Michael turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Sarah avoided his gaze, her face warming under the weight of her embarrassment. That's a tough field, James said, nodding approvingly. I'm sure you've seen your share of challenges. Sarah forced a smile. Yes, I have. The exchange was brief, but it left her feeling even more out of place. She wanted to say something, to apologize or explain herself, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she sank deeper into her seat, her mind replaying the events of the day. As the plane began its descent toward New York, Sarah's thoughts crystallized. She had misjudged Michael, not just once but repeatedly. She had allowed her biases to cloud her judgment, projecting her insecurities onto him. Now, watching him interact with the passengers around them, she saw him for who he truly was: a leader, a thinker, and above all, a person who deserved respect. For the first time in years, Sarah felt the sting of genuine regret. She didn't just owe Michael an apology. She owed herself a moment of reflection, a chance to confront the biases that had driven her actions. The question was, would she have the courage to admit it? The plane's seatbelt sign dinged off as passengers began settling into the long flight. Michael remained immersed in his thoughts, while Sarah struggled with a storm of emotions. The hum of conversation around them was interrupted by a familiar voice. Well, look who's jet-setting in style." Michael looked up, startled. Standing in the aisle, holding a small carry-on, was Emily Chun, his longtime colleague and one of the lead engineers at TechVision. She was dressed casually, but with the same no-nonsense energy she always brought to their office. "Emily," Michael exclaimed, standing to greet her. "What are you doing on this flight?" "I could ask you the same thing," Emily replied, shaking his hand warmly. "I'm heading to New York for the summit on AI ethics and healthcare. What about you?" "Same," Michael said with a grin. "Didn't know you'd be attending." Emily motioned to the flight attendant to stow her bag and then took an empty seat near Michael. As she settled in, her sharp eyes scanned the cabin, briefly locking onto Sarah, who shifted uncomfortably. "Small world," Emily commented, before turning her attention back to Michael. "How's the project coming along?" "The team's been buzzing with updates about the trial results." Michael's expression softened, his professional facade giving way to a more reflective tone. "It's promising. The AI's accuracy in predicting high-risk genetic markers is better than we hoped, but we still have a long way to go in integrating it into public healthcare systems." Their conversation had caught Sarah's attention. She sat rigid, pretending to read her tablet, but the mention of high-risk genetic markers made her pause. Her younger brother, Ethan, had recently been diagnosed with a rare genetic disorder, one that traditional diagnostic methods had missed for years. The idea of an AI capable of identifying such markers struck a personal chord. As the conversation between Michael and Emily continued, Sarah pieced together fragments of what she overheard. The project they were discussing wasn't just theoretical, it was groundbreaking. Michael described a tool that could analyze a patient's genetic data to predict susceptibility to rare diseases, enabling early intervention and personalized treatments. The implications were staggering, but Sarah's mind was focused on Ethan. Could this technology have helped him? Could it still? She felt a surge of mixed emotions: hope, curiosity, and an underlying frustration that something so impactful seemed out of reach for people like her family. "Is this the Gemini project?" Emily asked, lowering her voice slightly. Michael nodded, glancing around to ensure their conversation remained private. "It's still in development, but the preliminary trials are showing results beyond what we expected. If we can secure the funding and finalize the algorithms, it could redefine preventative care." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Gemini. The name sounded familiar. She dug through her memory, trying to connect the dots. Then it hit her. She had seen the name in a research article her brother had shared, one highlighting emerging technologies for genetic disorders. The article had praised TechVision's efforts, but noted the lack of accessibility for families like hers. Emily's voice broke through Sarah's thoughts. "Of course, the biggest challenge is scalability. If we can't make it affordable, the technology will end up benefiting only a select few." Michael sighed, nodding in agreement. "That's been my concern from the beginning. What's the point of innovation if it's only for the privileged? We need to find a way to make this accessible to everyone." The word struck Sarah like a blow. For all her initial judgments about Michael, here he was, voicing the very frustrations she had felt about the tech world, its tendency to prioritize profit over people. Her thoughts were interrupted as Emily turned to her. "Hi, I don't think we've met. I'm Emily Chun." Caught off guard, Sarah hesitated before shaking her hand. Sarah Williams. I'm, just a passenger. Emily chuckled. Aren't we all? So, what do you do? I'm a financial analyst, Sarah replied, her voice more subdued than usual. She glanced at Michael, who was observing the exchange with a neutral expression. I actually know a bit about tech vision. Your work is impressive. Emily raised an eyebrow, sensing an unspoken history between Sarah and Michael. It's a team effort, she said diplomatically. But I'll admit, working with Michael keeps all of us on our toes. Michael gave a small smile, but the tension between him and Sarah was palpable. Emily seemed to pick up on it, but chose not to comment, instead turning back to Michael to discuss logistics for the upcoming summit. Sarah's mind raced as she processed everything she had learned. She couldn't ignore the growing knot of guilt in her chest. Her initial assumptions about Michael had been completely wrong, but her thoughts kept circling back to Ethan. Could the Gemini project offer hope for him? She leaned slightly toward Michael, her voice hesitant. This Gemini project you're working on, is it focused on rare genetic disorders? Michael looked at her, surprised by the question. Yes, among other things. Why? Sarah hesitated, unsure of how much to share. My younger brother, he has a genetic disorder. It took years for doctors to diagnose him. If your project works the way you describe, it could help people like him, couldn't it? Michael's expression softened. For the first time since their initial confrontation, he saw not the sharp, judgmental woman from the boarding gate, but someone carrying the weight of personal pain. That's the goal, he said gently, to help people get answers before it's too late. Sarah nodded, her throat tightening. She wanted to say more, to apologize, to explain herself, but the words felt stuck. Instead, she looked away, focusing on the distant hum of the engines. The conversation shifted again, but the air between Sarah and Michael remained charged. Emily, sensing the tension, turned to Sarah. You should come to the summit, she said suddenly. It's open to the public. You get a chance to see what we're working on up close. Sarah blinked, surprised by the invitation. I don't know if I... You should, Michael interjected, his voice steady. It's not just for industry insiders. People like your brother are exactly why we're doing this. For the first time, Sarah met Michael's gaze without hesitation. She saw no anger, no condescension, only sincerity. It was a moment of understanding, fragile but real. As the plane continued its journey, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her life had shifted in some indefinable way. The Gemini project wasn't just a symbol of what technology could achieve. It was a reminder of the connections that bound people together, even when they least expected it. But as much as the conversation had offered hope, it also unearthed a new tension. Sarah couldn't ignore the nagging thought that her earlier confrontation with Michael had been more than a passing incident. It was a reflection of deeper biases she had yet to confront. And now, faced with the reality of his work and its potential impact on her brother, she realized she had more than one bridge to mend. The cabin lights flickered briefly, jolting passengers out of their quiet routines. A low hum, different from the usual engine sound, resonated through the plane. Michael instinctively removed his headphones, glancing out the window for any sign of trouble. Beside him, Emily's posture stiffened, her engineer's mind immediately on alert. The intercom crackled, and the captain's voice came through, calm but firm. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing some minor technical difficulties with our navigation system. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Our crew is addressing the situation. The words were meant to reassure, but they only heightened the tension. Around the cabin, passengers exchanged uneasy looks, their murmurs growing louder. Sarah gripped the armrest, her knuckles turning white. She wasn't a nervous flyer, but the change in the plane's hum sent a shiver down her spine. Emily leaned toward Michael, her voice low. That doesn't sound like standard turbulence. Did you hear the system reboot sound just now? Michael nodded. Something's interfering with the avionics. It could be a software issue. Minutes passed, each one heavier than the last. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, their professional smiles stretched thin as they tried to keep passengers calm. Then the plane shuddered, a sudden dip sending gasps through the cabin. Overhead luggage compartments rattled, and a baby's cry pierced the tension. Michael's mind raced. He had studied aviation software during a project collaboration years ago, and the symptoms were eerily familiar. This wasn't just a glitch. The captain's voice returned, less composed this time. We're encountering issues with the autopilot system and primary navigation. Our team is working to resolve it. I need everyone to remain calm and seated. Emily shot Michael a look. This isn't normal. It's not, he agreed, his voice tight. This could be a cyber attack. Sarah, sitting stiffly across the aisle, overheard their exchange. A cyber attack? On a plane? That's not possible, is it? Emily turned to her, her face serious. It's entirely possible. Modern aircraft rely heavily on software. If someone gains access to those systems, Michael nodded grimly. It's not unheard of, but if that's the case, we're dealing with more than just technical failure. As the plane shook again, the murmurs turned into outright panic. A passenger toward the front stood, shouting at a flight attendant for answers, while others scrambled for their phones, trying to connect to the in-flight Wi-Fi. "Stay seated," barked a flight attendant, her voice sharp. "Phones off. Please remain calm." Michael unbuckled his seatbelt. Emily grabbed his arm. "What are you doing?" "I'm going to the cockpit," he said. "If this is what I think it is, the pilots might need help isolating the breach." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "You can't just walk into the cockpit. That's not how it works." Michael met her gaze evenly. "Do you have a better idea?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again, the tension in his expression silencing her protest. Emily stood. "I'm coming with you." The two of them moved toward the front of the plane. A flight attendant intercepted them, her face pale but determined. "Sir, you need to sit down." Michael showed her his Tech Vision ID badge. "We might be able to help. If this is a software issue." The attendant hesitated, glancing toward the cockpit door, then back at them. After a moment, she nodded tightly and let them through. Inside the cockpit, the scene was chaotic. The pilot and co-pilot were frantically pressing buttons, trying to override the unresponsive systems. The air was thick with tension, the sound of alarms filling the small space. "What's going on?" Michael asked. The captain looked up briefly, sweat beading on his forehead. "Our navigation system is compromised. The autopilot's locked, and manual controls aren't responding properly. We've lost stable communication with air traffic control." Emily leaned over the console, scanning the screens. "Have you checked for external interference? This could be a remote breach." The captain frowned. "A breach? You mean like a hack?" Michael stepped forward. "Yes. We've seen cases like this in other critical systems, power grids, hospitals. If someone's targeting the plane, they might be manipulating the software." The co-pilot gestured to one of the screens. "We've been trying to isolate the issue, but everything's tangled in loops. It's like the system's fighting back against us." Emily's fingers flew across the keyboard of an auxiliary console. "Let me take a look. Michael, I'll need you to pull the diagnostic logs." Back in the cabin, the passengers were growing restless. Sarah watched the cockpit door anxiously, her mind racing. She didn't understand the technical details of what Michael and Emily were doing, but the fear in the air was undeniable. She thought of Ethan again, of how fragile life could be. The irony wasn't lost on her, that the man she had judged so harshly earlier might now be the one saving her life. A sudden thought struck her. She had experience with financial systems, another domain heavily reliant on software. Maybe she couldn't help with the plane's navigation directly, but she understood breaches, how attackers exploited systems. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. Inside the cockpit, Emily cursed under her breath. They've buried the interference signal under layers of fake commands. It's like peeling an onion. Michael was focused on another console, his jaw tight. It's definitely a breach. Look at this. Unauthorized access attempts logged just before the system crash. Sarah appeared in the doorway. I might be able to help. Michael turned, surprised. What are you talking about? I work with financial systems. If this breach is structured anything like the ones I've seen, there might be patterns, signatures, left behind in the logs. Can I see them? The captain glanced at Michael, uncertain. Is she with you? Michael hesitated, then nodded. Let her try. Sarah slid into the co-pilot seat, her hands trembling slightly as she navigated the interface. Here, she said after a moment, pointing at the screen. These sequences, they're time-stamped. If we isolate the source IPs associated with them, we can find the entry point. Emily caught on immediately. Smart. We can backtrack and cut the connection before it spreads further. Michael worked quickly, his fingers flying over the keyboard. There. The main interference is routed through an unsecured relay. It's piggybacking off the in-flight Wi-Fi. Emily swore. Whoever's behind this is using the passenger's devices as part of the attack. The co-pilot looked over, incredulous. Can you shut it down? Michael nodded. We'll have to block all outgoing connections and reboot the affected systems. It's risky, but it's our best shot. The next 10 minutes were a blur of focused effort. Michael and Emily coordinated with the pilots while Sarah monitored the systems, her earlier doubts and judgments replaced by determination. Finally, Emily hit the last key. Rebooting now, she announced. The cockpit went silent as the systems powered down and restarted. The tension was suffocating as everyone held their breath. Then, one by one, the consoles lit up, their alerts turning green. Controls are back online, the captain said, his voice shaking with relief. We're stable. Back in the cabin, the mood shifted as the captain made an announcement, his tone steady again. Ladies and gentlemen, the technical issues have been resolved. We'll be continuing to New York as planned. Thank you for your cooperation. A wave of applause rippled through the cabin, passengers cheering and clapping. But Michael, Emily, and Sarah were too exhausted to celebrate. As they returned to their seats, Sarah looked at Michael, her expression a mixture of gratitude and guilt. I misjudged you, she said quietly. Thank you for everything. Michael gave her a small, tired smile. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do next. For Sarah, those words would stay with her long after the plane touched down in New York. The cabin slowly returned to calm as the passengers settled back into their seats, the initial panic subsiding. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, reassuring everyone that the plane was stable and on course to New York. The tense atmosphere lingered, but a collective sigh of relief could be felt throughout the aircraft. Michael sat back in his seat, his expression calm but weary. Emily, seated across the aisle, had already fallen into a light nap, her exhaustion catching up with her after the intense events in the cockpit. Sarah, however, remained wide awake, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, guilt mingling with an unfamiliar sense of admiration for the man she had once dismissed. She glanced at Michael, who was staring out the window, lost in his own reflections. Taking a deep breath, Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt and shifted slightly to face him. Michael, she began, her voice hesitant. Can we talk? Michael turned, his eyes steady but guarded. Of course. Sarah's hands twisted together, the words difficult to find. I owe you an apology, she said finally, for how I treated you earlier. I made assumptions about you, about who you are, and I was wrong. I'm not proud of how I acted. Michael didn't respond immediately, studying her face. He could see the sincerity in her expression, the vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. I appreciate you saying that, he said quietly, but why did you assume what you did? Sarah looked down, her voice thick with emotion. It's not an excuse, but I've spent so much of my life fighting to be taken seriously. In my field, I've been judged for how I look where I come from, and I guess I started judging others the same way. It's not right, but it's what happened. She hesitated, then added, and maybe there's something more. My brother Ethan, he's been struggling with a genetic disorder for years. Hearing about the Gemini project, it just hit close to home. I think I let that frustration spill over. Michael's expression softened. I'm sorry to hear about your brother. Is he getting the care he needs? Sarah sighed. He's trying, but the treatments are expensive, and they don't always work. It's hard watching someone you love suffer and feeling powerless to help. Michael nodded, understanding her pain. That's exactly why we're working on Gemini. It's not just about innovation. It's about making sure families like yours don't have to go through what you're going through. No one should feel powerless when it comes to their health. Sarah was quiet for a moment, absorbing his words. Then she looked at him, her voice firmer now. You said earlier that innovation should serve everyone, not just the privileged. Do you really believe that? Absolutely, Michael said without hesitation. Technology is a tool. It should be used to level the playing field, not widen the gap. But making that a reality is harder than it sounds. It takes resources, collaboration, and a willingness to challenge the system. Sarah nodded slowly. I want to help, she said suddenly. I don't know how, but if there's anything I can do, anything to support what you're doing, I'm in. Michael raised an eyebrow, surprised but impressed. It's not easy work, and it requires commitment. But if you're serious, I'd be happy to have you involved. Sarah smiled for the first time that day. I'm serious. As the flight continued, their conversation deepened. Michael shared more about the challenges he faced as a CEO. Not just the technical hurdles, but the personal ones. The constant scrutiny, the doubts from investors who couldn't see past his age or background, the endless fight to prove himself. For years, he had poured everything into Tech Vision, not just to succeed, but to make a difference. People always talk about how technology is shaping the future, Michael said. But it's not just about machines or algorithms. It's about people. If we lose sight of that, then all the innovation in the world won't matter. Sarah listened intently, her earlier prejudice melting away as she saw the depth of his character. Michael wasn't just a brilliant entrepreneur. He was someone who cared deeply about fairness, about creating a world where everyone had a chance. The announcement for descent interrupted their conversation. The plane began its slow approach toward New York, the sprawling city lights coming into view. Around them, passengers began preparing for landing, the earlier crisis now a memory fading into relief. As the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, a round of applause broke out in the cabin. For the first time, Sarah joined in, clapping not just for the safe landing, but for the unexpected journey she had experienced during the flight. At the gate, passengers disembarked, many pausing to thank the flight attendants and crew. Michael, Emily, and Sarah lingered near the exit, exchanging contact information and discussing plans to follow up. Emily grinned at Sarah as they waited for their bags. You survived your first crash course in tech heroics. Welcome to the club. Sarah laughed lightly, though her expression was thoughtful. I think I learned more in one flight than I have in years of work. Michael extended a hand to Sarah. You've got my number. If you're serious about helping, let's talk soon. She shook his hand firmly. I will. And thank you, Michael. Not just for what you did today, but for everything you're trying to do. As Michael and Emily walked away, Sarah stood alone for a moment, watching the bustling airport around her. She felt lighter somehow, as if a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying had been lifted. For years, she had seen the world through a lens of competition and judgment, but now she saw something different, a chance for collaboration, for change. Outside the airport, Michael and Emily waited for their ride. Emily glanced at him, a sly smile on her face. Looks like you made a new ally today. Michael chuckled. Sometimes the best partnerships come from the most unexpected places. Emily nodded thoughtfully. You think she'll stick with it? Michael looked back toward the terminal, where Sarah was just stepping outside, her face lit by the glow of the city lights. I think she will. People are capable of surprising you, especially when they're given a second chance. As the car pulled up, Michael climbed in, a quiet sense of optimism settling over him. Today had been more than just a flight. It had been a reminder of why he started this journey, of the power of connection and redemption. For Sarah, Michael, and everyone on board that flight, the journey had been more than just a trip from San Francisco to New York. It was a lesson in humility, understanding, and the boundless potential of human ingenuity when driven by empathy and purpose. And as the city loomed large in front of them, it felt like the beginning of something new.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.